We have an exciting panel for our last panel. It promises to be super energetic, and I think I'm really looking forward to it. First off, I want to introduce our chair of the panel, who is Dr. Michael Weber. He's a professor of mechanical engineering at UT. So I think he's probably going to counter all the gigums and howdies or whatever with some hookums. He is not just at a university so he can do research. He's actually an incredible teacher. He's won several outstanding teacher awards, and I can testify of how wonderful, because I've taken actually one of his classes. So just really great. He's also worked on a lot of really interesting projects over the course of his career. I'll mention just a couple. One is the Pecan Street project, which, as HEI, of course, we love the public-private partnerships. That one was really focused on the innovation and development of smart grid solutions in an Austin neighborhood. So, thinking about all the Internet of Things with all of our home appliances and so forth, and how all those interact on a much larger scale. He's written several books on the history of energy. They're remarkably fascinating. And then he's also a movie star. So he has starred in Energy at the Movies, which is a PBS special that has national syndication. So please welcome Dr. Michael Weber.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and welcome to Austin, my hometown. I'm actually an Austin native. There are like three of us, so it's good to meet you. I think a fun fact about me is Elon Musk is my neighbor, which is really kind of bizarre because he's in the news a lot for the things he's doing in the neighborhood. So that's my neighborhood. So maybe we could talk about love thy neighbor and cars and everything else as a part of this discussion today. One thing I'll talk about, just set the stage a little bit. The overall theme for what we're talking about is sort of the benefits and challenges of emerging technologies and fuels. Transportation's next stop, or for this particular conversation, what's changing in the world of transportation for, say, 2030 to 2040, say the next 5 to 15 years, and what does that mean for HEI? What do they need to think about? And I think there's a couple different timelines we're working on. One is there's a timeline that energy and transportation fuels are always changing. I mean, the dynamism, I don't even know what the word is, but the dynamics of the energy industry, it's always changing. Yet some things don't change very quickly. So if you look at the modern energy sector around the world, about 60% of the world's energy is used in 4 devices: a gas turbine, a steam turbine, a gasoline engine, and a diesel engine. So 4 devices are responsible for 60% of the world's energy consumption. And those devices were invented as recently as 1893. So we're running the global modern economy on 130-year-old technology or older. The other 40% is basically burning stuff and stoves and cooktops and fireplaces, which is even older than those other devices. So there's some element of energy which is relatively slow changing, yet you have these eras of fast changes to technology on the consumption of, say, electricity, for example. I'm thinking of like cathode ray tube displays. You remember those old computer displays that were really deep and heavy and they had a curved screen and they're expensive. They took up all the space and didn't work that well. And then we replaced them with flat panel displays, which were higher performing, brighter, lighter, more efficient, just better overall. That took like 10 years to go from CRTs to LCDs. So you can't even buy a cathode ray tube now. And same kind of thing with smartphones, going from a flip phone to smartphone. So sometimes a technology substitution can happen in 10 years or less. Yeah, we're operating the economy on devices that were invented a long time ago. And that's sort of a challenge. And what it really means is that there's long periods of stability or stasis punctuated by rapid eras of change, so like this punctuated equilibrium. And so we see that if we think about transportation, 2 examples that come to mind. James Prescott Joule, 1839. So Joule said, "I can hardly doubt that electromagnetism will ultimately be substituted for steam to propel machinery." So in 1839, Joule, for whom we have a unit of energy, the joule, he said basically electric vehicles are going to replace heat at some point. Now we're 180 years into that story. We're almost there, so it takes a while. That same year, 1839, there was an announcement by William Robert Grove at the Academy of Sciences in Paris, where he announced his hydrogen fuel cell. So 1839, 2 things were announced or revealed or stated that might affect the future of transportation. So it can take a while to go from idea or concept out to the market, but then sometimes once you go into the market, it moves really quickly. So this is part of the mismatch we're dealing with. Long-lived energy assets, slow-moving energy conversion technology, but rapid adoption on the consumption side sometimes for certain types of technologies. And so this becomes an issue if you have a 10-year car, you're plugging into a 50-year coal plant or whatever. So these are some of the things we deal with in transportation energy as these come together. And that's part of the challenge if you're a public-private partnership trying to think about the future as we electrify and everything else. Well, thankfully, we got a great panel of experts who will shed some light on that for us. I'll introduce them all, then they'll make some comments, then I'll ask them some questions, then we'll go to you for questions. We have a couple microphones. My farthest left, your right, we have Dr. Daniel Sperling. Dr. Sperling is a distinguished Blue Planet Prize professor of engineering, environmental science, and policy, and founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, which is recognized as a leading university center for sustainable transportation, which is true. It's UC Davis is great at many things. And by the way, the dean of engineering there was a colleague of mine here at UT before you guys got him, Rich Corsi. He held the transportation seat on the California Air Resources Board for 16 years and served as chair of the Transportation Research Board, or TRB, of the National Academies in 2015 and 16. Among his many honors are the Lifetime Research Education Award of the Council of University Transportation Centers and the Lifetime S.S. Steinberg Award for the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, both in 24. Induction to the National Academy of Engineering in 22. Great honor, by the way, all these honors. The 2018 Roy Crum Award from TRB, its highest research award, and the 2013 Blue Planet Prize from the Asahi Glass Foundation Prize for being a pioneer in opening up new fields of study to create more efficient, low carbon, and environmentally beneficial transportation systems. He served twice as lead author for the IPCC, so he got 0.3% of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. And actually, if we amortize that over the five of us, we all got like 0.06 if we share it across the table. 0.06% that Peace Prize, and he's co-authored or authored over 250 technical papers, 13 books. Really great to have Dan Sperling here. And when was it you were on? Was it the Colbert Show or the Jon Stewart Daily Show? Was that a decade ago? Which book was that for?
2 billion cars.
2 billion cars. I just remember thinking that was awesome. So I got to watch you on that, and I guess perhaps we all saw you there. So I'm glad Dan is here. Next to him is Gary Savage, who's president of ExxonMobil Biomedical Sciences. He holds a PhD in toxicology from the University of Rochester, an MBA from Rutgers, and I believe a degree in biology from Queen Mary's College. Is that right? So he completed a postdoc at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Chemical Defense and is a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology. He was the health science executive at Concave in Belgium, and he's active in global scientific committees helping to prioritize and tackle complex environmental health challenges and opportunities. I believe you're in your 20th year at ExxonMobil. Is that correct? All right. So you're a survivor. So we like that. I do a lot of collaboration at ExxonMobil, so I get to say that. Next, we have Tim French, who he and I try to coordinate on our jackets. We almost got it. So we're close with the pattern blue. If you look closely, his is just a little darker. But that's not a comment on his soul, just the color of his jacket. Tim French serves as general counsel for the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association, or EMA. And in that role, he's helped to negotiate most of the EMA and CARB regulations related to the control of emissions from the new trucks and truck engines. And he's represented, is it EMA or EMA? Forgive my ignorance. Is it EMA? EMA, okay. He's also represented EMA in the leading cases shaping the scope of federal preemption under the Clean Air Act, including a case before the U.S. Supreme Court 2004. So great to have his comments. And then immediately next to me is William Chernikov, who is currently the Senior Manager of Global Research and Innovation at the Toyota Mobility Foundation. And in this role, Dr. Chernikov currently leads and established the foundation's original research agenda, initiatives and programs, while also providing technology guidance to various projects with a focus on both near and long-term perspectives. Dr. Chernikov identifies, conceives, and executes new technology approaches and enhance the solutions implemented by the foundation and its partners. What a great lineup with a view from foundation world, corporate world, public-private partnerships, academia. So great mix of people to offer some expert insights, and we'll just let them make some comments, then we'll have some conversation. And Dan, we'll start with you at the end, if you don't mind, as maybe set the stage, open it up for us.
Well, thank you very much. I'll bring the diversity with non-blue jacket and a hat. My story, the story of this panel, I think, is very simple. Eventually, essentially all vehicles are going to be operated with electric motors. And Arvind from PACCAR said that in the earlier session today. The question is, well, one question is, when is eventually? But then there's a long transition period. And so that transition period is going to vary dramatically over time, over space, different regions, and it's really uncertain. We've got, just look at today, you've got tariffs that are uncertain. You've got regulations that are uncertain. And you've got markets that are uncertain. So how this is all going to play out in a kind of the transition part of this has a huge amounts of uncertainty about it. But some of the things that we can think about in terms of getting there, and actually at the end state, there's relevant issues for HEI as well. But one of the things is through the transition, and maybe in that period of eventuality, there'll be plug-in hybrids. And this means vehicles that have a small combustion engine along with the electric motors. And so there will be combustion for sure for a very long time in plug-in hybrids. And we can talk about why there's going to be plug-in hybrids. I was talking to Arvind from PACCAR, and he said that's the one thing he forgot to mention in his talk. Arvind's here somewhere, I think. He's back there. Okay, good. I didn't want to say things that, misspeak. Plug-in hybrids, PHEVs we call them, for both trucks and cars are going to be a thing for a very long time. I would point out, actually, so I was a regulator, a part-time regulator for many years. I like to say I'm an academic, I'm an ex-regulator, and I'm a policy wonk. And so that's kind of how I come at this. And so from the policy wonk idea, California's regulations for zero emission vehicles does provide for plug-in hybrids. So for light duty, 20% of the 20% of the so-called zero emission vehicles in 2035 can be plug-in hybrids and still meet the requirements. Okay, so getting into some little pieces of all this is hydrogen combustion also could be or likely will be part of this process, especially in trucks. And because when we talk about zero emission, by the way, that's usually the real zero emission would be a battery electric or a fuel cell hydrogen vehicle. So both of those truly have no emissions from the vehicle. All right, so then we get, and then what we're going to have for a very long time as we transition away from fossil fuels, we're going in the transportation sector, we will have many liquid and gaseous fuels that are made in many different ways. And certainly we'll have the hydrogen that I was just talking about that can be made in many different ways, but we can have all kinds of synthetic fuels and biofuels. In fact, in California right now, 3/4 of all the diesel fuel is actually biofuel, renewable diesel. So it's a drop-in fuel, use it in the same stations, use it in the same vehicles. It's produced very differently, of course. So, that's just an illustration of this transition, how it can play out. So, and then these synthetic fuels these are sometimes called e-fuels made with hydrogen and carbon. They can be constructed in ways that are essentially identical to diesel or gasoline. And a lot of these fuels, so as I talk about this, though, I said this is land vehicles, but these liquid and gaseous fuels are even more likely to play a large role in aviation and maritime. Okay, so when I think about this I'm just going to do real quick. What does this mean in terms of health impacts and HEI? Part of it depends on HEI. How much does it expand its boundaries as it looks at these health effects? But so I said there's the synthetic fuels. What are the emission impacts? And it can be made in different ways. So there's different emission impacts. Ammonia is another one that could be used, probably more likely in maritime. We have so the tailpipe emissions are zero, but the upstream emission, there's all kinds of upstream emissions from the battery manufacturing, from the vehicle manufacturing, from the minerals that are used. So there's all kinds of interesting and important upstream emissions. Another thing is battery fires. So this is a new thing. So there's fires and there's all kinds of emissions that are coming out of these different types of batteries. And remember, the batteries are not static, kind of playing off of what William said. These batteries are going to evolve, or Michael said. William has his own ideas. And Michael said, technology is evolving. So even for batteries, in 5 or 10 years, it's very likely we'll have completely different chemistries for batteries that are being used in our vehicles. Just a couple other thoughts. So then we're going to be making more fuels in biofuel refineries. Like I said, in California already, 3/4 of the diesel is made in oil refineries that were converted to make this renewable diesel. You got aviation and maritime fuels that are going to be coming into existence. You got the emissions from the ships and the planes that are going to be varying, be different in the future. So, and just one last thought, before I pass it on is that, as I said, what I'm really become in my old age is a policy wonk. I love policy. It was part of my experience being in government as a regulator, but seeing that there's so little sophistication outside of the regulating agencies and the companies that are regulated, understanding the details matter so much. And I know my panel member are going to reaffirm that. And so understanding that is really crucial. So we've got all these policies. So coming out of California, I'll just talk about the California ones because they tend to be more at the cutting edge. We've got a requirement for 100% light duty vehicle, 100% zero emission light duty vehicles by 2035. We've got a similar requirement for trucks. It's not quite as aggressive through 2035. We've got rules for off-road vehicles. We've got a requirement that all buses be zero emission. We've got a low carbon fuel standard that requires the fuels, the liquid and gaseous fuels that are supplied to transportation, that the carbon intensity must shrink over time. We've got new rules like, well, some that are still in process, like indirect source rules, which say you put a bubble over like a set of warehouses and you say, okay, you have to reduce the emissions from, this within this bubble. You figure, you, the warehouses and your and your suppliers and your vehicles operators figure out how to meet it. So there's a lot of trade-offs there. We've got in the maritime world, they just adopted, the International Maritime Organization, which is kind of the organization that oversees it, has just adopted a new rules without getting into the details. That's essentially a low carbon fuel standard going forward. And one other the one last one, an idea, health effects. What about noise? Because one of the new technologies coming along are going to be these low-level flying drones. So I just spent 2 weeks in China. Almost half the car companies in China are getting into the business of these flying cars. They're small, they'll eventually be automated, probably electric, but there's going to be a lot of noise. So HEI, there's another topic for you. Thank you.
That's great, Dan. Thank you. And Gary, love your thoughts. I mean, I think no one thinks about the future of energy quite as intently as ExxonMobil. So your thoughts about future of energy, where we're headed, would be great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so as my intro indicated, so I'm actually a health professional. I'll be talking with you a little bit about what we ExxonMobil have in our global energy outlook, and you could actually find that online. You could get a sense as to in terms of what we think the future might look like. For us, it's really important to understand what that future might look like, as it's critical to weave into our business plan. So there's a real tangible reason why we do that. A couple of things that I wanted to talk with you about was basically the transition and then trade-offs. So those are the two topic areas I'd like to make sure I focus on. In terms of the transition and where might we be coming from as ExxonMobil, we have a technology organization. We really think about advancing key technologies, a lot of which has been talked about here. One thing, for example, if you take out this device, most of you, maybe all of you have something like this, a cell phone, lithium-ion battery. Many people don't realize actually in 2019, there was the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was given to 3 individuals. One of them was from ExxonMobil for the invention of the lithium-ion battery. So we actually invented the lithium-ion battery. Actually, there's another person, John Goodenough. He's actually from
My colleague. Yeah.
Yes.
He just died a couple years ago, but he and I got lunch together quite often. So
Yeah, so he was the other of the 3 people. He was another one from UT Austin. Anyway, so we have some strong interest in developing the technology, and maybe thinking about that cell phone. So sometimes I know my kids get into this situation. They'll look at their cell phone and they'll look at, oh my goodness, I have 50% of it's 50% charged. I don't know what I'm going to do, and they're freaking out. They're looking for somewhere to plug it in. That's a wonderful developed country kind of an issue. If you think about the 8 billion people that live in the world, 4 billion of them are at a level of what we call the modern energy minimum. Basically, a level below that, they don't have access to reliable electricity or energy. They don't have clean cooking fuels, and 700 million of them today they live in abject poverty. That's $2.15 a day is what they earn. So 4 billion people today. That's the situation today. And how do we get the energy in different ways across the world that would help get them out of that sort of minimum energy minimum? The future out to 2050, that's how far out we try to look. In 2050, you'll see an additional 2 billion people. So we'll go from 8 billion to 10 billion people. With this transition, in terms of the growth of the population, obviously a lot of that population will not be in developed countries. It'll be in sort of the non-OECD countries. But with that growth, there's really this transition the expectation is that it'll involve significant fast-paced movement out and into the middle class. So what that entails is really access to energy. You're talking about infrastructure. You're talking about the energy that it takes for travel, et cetera, that's going to be part of that equation. So there's going to be an increase in overall energy demand pretty significantly, certainly by the non-OECD countries. Something along the lines of, plus 15% in total net across the world, but largely speaking, coming out of the non-OECD countries. So that's the world that we see in the future. But then in terms of the energy, where's the energy actually going to come from? That it will look different in the future. It will look different out to 2050 would be our perspective. Oil and gas, as was mentioned, there still is a strong place for oil and gas from our perspective. What folks don't often realize is actually the sort of light duty transport that we spend a lot of time talking about. That's in the grand scheme of things a relatively small area in which our products actually get utilized. You're talking about the hard to decarbonize sectors, commercial transportation, industry sectors that require high thermal capacity, high thermal energy that comes from these dense liquid fuels. So that's where there's going to continue to be a need there. So we will in fact see, as we get out to 2050, for example, of course, solar and wind will increase pretty significantly in terms of the slope, the pace, the amount that they contribute to the overall energy demand from 3 to 12%. So keep that in mind. I mean, it's a huge steep curve that they're going to be climbing, but it's going from 3 to 12%, while oil and gas still will be at well above 50%. Coal will eventually come down, is our projection. And then you will have some contribution to bioenergy. In terms of the different sectors, for example, like as I mentioned, the light duty vehicles, electricity, as we talked about, electricity is definitely the theme where things are going. You will have different chemistries, different things to thinking about in terms of solid state batteries. You'll have a lot of the focus tends to be on the cathode side of the battery, right? You're talking about lithium, for example, but there's, I think, huge technical space and things coming in terms of innovation on the anode side that'll drive different things that we need to be thinking about from the battery perspective. Good, some very good, and maybe some that from the environmental health perspective, we might need to be thoughtful about. Heavy duty, you have the smaller and then the larger, think like long haul type trucks that would be taking things for long distances. Yeah, I mean, I think across that space again, that's in general, the larger vehicles, you need to have that high thermal density, basically energy density, and it comes from those liquid fuels today. So that's still a space where you're going to still see significant evolution. In the aviation side, as was mentioned, the sustainable aviation fuels, the projection there by the global aviation industry is something like by 2030, 10% of the fuel would be sustainable aviation fuel, with potentially that increasing past 2030. And then interestingly, as was mentioned for the ships, and in fact, I think it was in December of 2024, just recently, the IMO, they basically went ahead and they gave a interim approval, I believe they called it, for different types of fuel mixes, but specifically ammonia, methanol, specifically ammonia. So ammonia, and some of the ship companies are really focused now on ammonia as a fuel for shipping, giving them some of the flexibility that they need. So that's the way we see some of the future playing out. In terms of trade-offs, I mentioned I want to talk about trade-offs. I mean, my perspective more from the environmental health perspective, and maybe a poll to the audience, right? HEI community. So you probably have, how many people would consider themselves exposure modelers? How about atmospheric chemistry modelers? How about life cycle assessment modelers? How many people are life cycle assessment and atmospheric chemistry modelers? One. How many people actually have ever worked with folks that do energy system modeling? Great. How many people have worked with folks that do integrated assessment modeling? So a subset of the folks. And generally speaking, I'm going to guess, based on at least the publications out there, it's sort of siloed. You try to crosstalk, you try to bring stuff in, and it's a bit clunky at a minimum. There's some really nice work being done now to really validate within those spaces, but even across those spaces, people are talking about how do you really bring things together. My perspective from the environmental health side is if you draw your box around things too small, you're not really going to get at the key environmental health consideration. So for example, some trade-offs just to think about for this discussion, right? A lot of the focus that has been out there on the passenger vehicle side, sort of tank to wheels rather than well to wheels. So when you do that and you set the standards on that basis, you're actually thinking about the box of sort of the vehicle usage. You're not actually thinking about from the manufacturing process all the way to the end of the life cycle. Some things that my understanding is that, as some of the things we talked about earlier this morning, in terms of some of the companies that are really focused on trying to increase the mileage, the efficiency, and miles per gallon, for example, if you look at the data, there's been a slowing down of that in terms of focusing on it. In part, we believe because there's a shift to think about other zero emission type vehicles, for example, but also because, as was talked about this morning, it's sort of like you're at the point where basically you're filtering the air, right? Some of these systems are so clean that you're actually purifying the air. But it also brings in, if you continue to push to drive in that direction, you kind of bring heavier vehicles with more metals, with additional technology that maybe not, if you looked at it in a broader life cycle perspective, may not be really what you really want to get at. And then we hinted at, and some talked about even things like, for example, with the electric vehicles being heavier, but most importantly, the torque from electric vehicles causing the road additional wear on the tires, causing more particles to get out of the environment. These are all just trade-offs, right? We're making choices definitely driven by carbon intensity, for example, but there are other things that I think we need to think about. So that's going to be probably the theme that you're going to hear from me in terms of my comments here today. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much. I want to thank the crowd for being so polite. I love their clapping and all that's great. So Tim, love your comment.
Yeah, maybe that'll change
Yeah.
right now. First of all, let me give a disclaimer. What I'm talking about is my personal opinion. It's not necessarily reflective of the truck and engine industry as a whole. So this might be my last appearance in public. But I think what I want to talk about is ultimately, is there a research program for HEI that seems to be at the convergence of a lot of the things that we've been discussing? And I think there is. But first, I want to have a little bit of a reality check or a level set about where we are and what we're facing in terms of trucks. I'll be talking about trucks and the envisioned conversion of the truck transportation sector to zero emission vehicles. And in part, the first thing we have to acknowledge is there right now ongoing is a adverse regulatory shift, policy shift. If you look at efforts to undo regulations that mandate a shift to ZEVs for heavy duty vehicles, whether that's EPA's Phase 3 program, EPA's Clean Trucks program, whether or not EPA and the federal government are targeting California regulations and the waiver for California regulations, whether federal efforts will undermine other states that have opted in to California regulations to build their own ramp-ups for ZEV trucks. These things are happening. Very difficult. Imagine if you were the CEO of a truck company right now, and you're trying to let your shareholders know what your product plans are for the next 3 years, how much you're going to invest in ZEVs. What about the production lines that you've converted to ZEVs? What about the fact that federal incentives under NEVI programs or the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Act, congressionally appropriated funds, and we've seen maybe that doesn't matter anymore at all. So there's a reality here. There's a policy shift that I think we have to recognize. It's not going to go away, at least for the next 3.5 years. So with that as background, let's look at some of the challenges just from the existing regulations. Again, have a little bit of a reality check. And I'm talking just about trucks here. Under the current mandates, federal, California, state opt-ins, by 2035, roughly 17% of all trucks across all categories, 17% would need to be ZEVs. I'm talking primarily about battery electric vehicles. For class 7 and 8, a lot of people hypothesize that hydrogen fuel would be the choice for those vehicles. I'm not talking about that necessarily. But under those mandates, were they to be fully implemented, you would need approximately 103,000 public charging stations. You would need, 1.7 million depot-based charging stations for fleets that return home, 103,000 public charging stations, all at a cost of $43 billion between now and 2035 to build out that requisite infrastructure, recharging infrastructure for 17% of the truck fleet. In Texas alone, you'd need 3.5 billion to reach that target for 80,000 BEV trucks. And again, those costs are not accounting, as I said, for a hydrogen infrastructure. They're also not accounting for the costs, what people call behind the meter, in terms of utility upgrades, new switching stations, new transformers, those kinds of things. That's not included in these costs. So now, given that trajectory between now and 2035, those projected costs between now and 2035, the penetration rates that we have right now for BEVs, the fact that a BEV truck costs 2 to 3 times more than a conventionally fueled truck, the fact that there is no infrastructure, that it's lagging behind under some of these projections, you'd be needing to build 300 charging ports per week. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying these are very real challenges. And so maybe the timeline, the time horizon for some of this isn't 2032, isn't 2035, perhaps 2040, perhaps a little bit beyond. Perhaps it needs to be driven by the market a little bit more, because as we've heard, are fleet owners really in a line to buy a BEV truck right now? I would submit no. It's just not viable in the near term. And it's not going to get any easier given the aforementioned federal policy shifts that are actually antagonistic to these technologies for God knows why. So in this, interstitial, that's probably not the right word, space, in this interval, what can we do? How can we apply what will be a limited resource base, perhaps, to maximize return for the environment and public health? And let's think about a couple other things that we heard this morning that I think dovetail into what I'm talking about. We heard that 40 to 50% of the medium heavy duty truck fleet is perhaps pre-2010 technology, before the advent of after treatment systems, SCR systems, diesel particulate filters. And as we also heard, those technologies have incrementally improved every year. You're now seeing dual SCR systems. You're now seeing heated catalysts. You're now seeing ultra efficient PM filters, which literally almost go beyond the detection limit in terms of any PM coming out. And certainly for post 2016 product, I would let you know, those systems are much more robust. They last much longer. They're very, very good. They're not ZEVs. So for those who say ZEV or die, it's not going to scratch your itch, but we've got to face, in my view, some reality. So we heard that. We heard also, as I mentioned before, EVs cost 2 to 3 times more than conventionally fueled vehicles. We also heard with remarkable evidence behind it that there's impacts, disproportionate impacts on certain communities that any policy needs to account for in the near term as soon as possible. So let's look at a problem from this perspective. Were we to have $5 billion, not $43 billion plus, were we to have $5 billion that we could deploy between now and 2032, given all the uncertainties with the federal initiatives, how might we apply that $5 billion? Could we, for example, identify the geographic regions where there is a disproportionate impact from diesel pollution? Could we identify the fleet mix in those identified geographic areas? Could we identify the high emitters in those geographic areas? With that $5 billion, we could, if you look at $50,000 per used vehicle post 2016, that's 100,000 new vehicles, replacement vehicles. We take $5 billion, we get the oldest, dirtiest vehicles off the road in the most impacted communities. For that $5 billion, we are regulating the iceberg, not the tip of the iceberg. I would submit that HEI over the next couple of years do a quantitative, comparative cost-benefit analysis of, I incrementally incentivize somebody who won't buy a ZEV truck and introduce, a few of those. They may or may not get into a disadvantaged community. Footnote, they won't. Or we do a program as just described. I even have an acronym for such a program in honor of a beloved institution. I'm going to call it Veritas. And it stands for, hold on, wait, I made a note. Vehicle Engine Replacement Integrated Technical Assessment, Veritas. So that's my pitch. That's my message. Thanks for listening.
Good. All right, William, let's hear your view.
I'll try to bring this up home, and the benefit of going, I guess, last is I don't have to repeat a lot of what was said, but I will go back a little bit in history because I think about 25 years ago, I had my first interaction with Health Effects Institute. I was in a group that had to do an assessment for the Boston, the MBTA, on what fuel they were going to replace some vehicles from air quality issues. And we must have done the right thing because I was simultaneously called in commie liberal tree hugger and an anti-environmentalist, depending on your perspective. So, but to your point, right, what effect can we have to the most people? And that was really the question here. We could spend money on one technology that would take a couple of years to deploy and would, have a few vehicles out there that would help acutely certain neighborhoods. Or we could look at the total area under the curve and maybe get an 80% reduction that went for everyone citywide. And that's kind of where we ended up. And so those same lessons 25 years ago, and there was somebody from HEI on the panel, this team, I think still hold true today. Right? What are these cumulative effects that we can have? The timing of the transition really matters. And just, bring a little maybe fun. Dan and I go back over 20 plus years. We don't always agree on stuff, but so I'll have to get one disagreement out of the way early. I don't know if they're truly ZEVs, Dan. I mean, we've heard now about the emissions from, they may be tailpipe ZEVs, but the tires and the brakes are really, we still need to, you've heard that from others. So I just have to get one contradiction in for Dan. So we're out of the way now. Now we can agree with the rest of the panel. So I want to bring a slightly different, complementary perspective to what's happening here. It's not just about the vehicles. A lot of the work that I do in the foundation is looking at how we deploy systems into different communities and neighborhoods and fundamentally think about how the mobility and transportation system is evolving. The vehicles are part of it, but a lot of it is also about the built environment and the acute effect that has, right? I don't have to tell anyone here that the toxicity isn't just about the rate of emissions, it's the exposure, right? And that is very much dictated about the built environment. And there's a paradigm that exists now, sort of that people think about. You've got car-based urbanism or transit-oriented development, and those bring different effects, right? Cities have a lot of air quality issues as well as the suburbs. We don't think that that paradigm needs to move forward. We think that there are some radically different designs that come forward that really fundamentally change the way people move. So different changes in total VMT and the vehicles that will be used, which will have drastic effects on the exposure that comes from the vehicles, because it also unlocks different types of vehicles. We've just been talking about passenger vehicles and trucks. We haven't talked about people's ability to walk, take scooters, and bike, right? Or the distances that are necessary to make that happen or have delivery. But it also is both ways, right? We can worry about the exposure that's coming from the vehicles and what that means in those communities. But what about the people on the bikes who are now being exposed to the vehicles? If we want to move people to different forms of mobility, we need to understand that exposure as well. So there's multiple different pathways for thinking about the vehicles of the future. It's not just about the powertrain, it is the vehicles themselves and the way that they are being used, what a lot of Japanese might call this Kaya equation that will lead to the total exposure. And if we're thinking about the research questions that are out there, how can these different scenarios of future mobility systems, if we project what they might be and we think about the way people move and the total number of vehicles that are there and the types of vehicles and what they are, what does that mean? And how can we use that information to inform policy? Right? There is a real opportunity there to fundamentally change and inform the way policymakers at the state and municipal level are thinking about the vehicles and not as siloed things, but as integrated parts of communities. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but these radically different forms of urban planning will fundamentally change the nature of the exposure and that I think people will be exposed to, including the ability to bring more nature into things, which has a lot of cleaning and beneficial effects, which could mitigate some of the exposure that's out there. It also matters locally as well, building on some of the other comments, right? It's not all communities are the same, right? The genesis of what LA motivated LA, given the urban form decades ago to impose or create some of those regulations, have a very different effect than they do here in Austin, right? Even with similar population densities and potentially mobility patterns. So we have to be very, very context dependent to think about what those health effects are moving forward. And there's a gap in the research that I think over the next 5 or so years is very important. But where are we going to be? It's not going to be business as usual. We're not going to just replace cars with different powertrains. We're going to fundamentally change the way we potentially use cars and other forms of mobility. And the substitution patterns between those different forms will inform what will have an effect. And by the way, public transit, even beyond buses, right? Subways aren't particularly clean either. Go into the DC Metro, for example, those walls are pretty dirty. That didn't come from people, that came from all the brake dust coming off of the train. So there's exposures that people don't think about in interesting things that need valid comparisons. So with that, let's open it up for discussion.
That's great. Thank you.
How does Steve done?
Yeah, we got them to clap eventually. So it's good. Great. I've got a variety of questions for you before we go to the audience. And maybe I'll start with Gary. Gary, you mentioned the Nobel Prize, so I can't help but bring that up. There were 3 winners of the Nobel Prize in 2019 for lithium ion. One was my colleague, John B. Goodenough, whose name is John B. Goodenough, which is crazy. And he was the oldest recipient of the Nobel Prize in 97. It was Stanley Whittingham from ExxonMobil. And I can't remember his name exactly. Akira Yoshino from Asahi.
Yep.
So it was an American, English, Japanese collaboration, great global collaboration. And I wonder, ExxonMobil is such a global company. What's the role of global collaboration for some things we're talking about? Do you see a role for that? Do you see different solutions in different places?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Related questions. Maybe you could look at them differently. Yeah. I mean, I think collaboration is critical. And I think it comes down to, I think some of the things that I was trying to emphasize is trying to anticipate or look into the future. What is the likely path that might actually occur in the future? But then also making sure you kind of have other eggs in the basket and thinking about the range of possibilities and the optionality that society needs. And from a research perspective, from the industry perspective, there's certain things that we do and can bring to the table. But in the broad sense of what we're talking about here, you have to interact with others. And if I even take it to the environmental health side, that was the technology side. I mean, what I was getting at was, right, I think from my side, I have a group of folks that are very good with atmospheric chemistry modeling, exposure modeling, but to actually really understand what's going on, we have to interact with others that understand energy systems. We have to understand integrated assessment modeling. We have to actually understand and weave that together to really understand the trade-offs that we're talking about. And that is a collaborative initiative that we have to think about there.
That's great. And also, if you have a global view, as ExxonMobil does, I know that if you look at gasoline, it might be dirty compared to a tailpipe, a gasoline tailpipe dirty compared to electric vehicle. United States, but it's much cleaner than burning cow dung in your cook stove in
Right.
sub-Saharan Africa or something like that, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And want to say something as well?
No, I just, these energy system models, and you brought up LCA. Just for context, I have a systems engineering background, and so I have a mixed kind of relationship with LCA. One of the problems is it takes averages instead of actually ask the question of, if you do an acute change, what is the net effect on something, right? It's a real problem with greenhouse gases, but it also can be a problem with some of the actual acute criteria pollutants as well, because you tend to put inputs in that are averages
Average. Yeah.
instead of the additionality question of, if I do this, I no longer have potentially zero carbon, or renewable energy available for this. So then therefore it's actually not using zero carbon energy. It's using, natural gas or hopefully not coal, but these offsets don't get calculated correctly. And that really matters if you're trying to understand the discrete acute effects of some of these changes that happen over time. So just a word of caution, LCA has its use, but sometimes it is the wrong tool for trying to get at some of these acute as well as diffuse changes.
Yeah, if I may, absolutely. I mean, I believe I'm saying the same thing, in fact, which is, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, atmospheric chemistry modelers and exposure modelers, but you want to understand more locally, right? And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here, where we might have averaged benefits, right? Driving carbon intensity down, driving carbon CO2 levels down. That's generally going to be good for air quality. But if you're actually talking about a local situation, what might it mean at the local situation? And that's where understanding the energy system, the bigger system, together with the local situation and the specific criteria pollutants, for example, in that region or local area, that's actually what we really need to understand.
Yeah, Dan, you'd like to make a comment? Yeah.
As someone who first brought LCA from academia into the real world of policy through the low carbon fuel standard, which we designed in 2007, I want to do a half-hearted defense of LCA. Half-hearted because I think, the larger theme is we need to understand the emissions along the whole chain of activities, the whole supply chain, all the upstream. And that's the number one challenge, is to nail down those numbers as precisely as possible. And whether that's for, materials come from different parts of the world, they're manufactured in different ways, they're all going to have different emissions at every step of the process. Then we get, this is with my policy wonk hat on, okay, what do we do with all that data and that information that is as disaggregated and precise as we can make it? Then, something like using LCA, like in a low carbon fuel standard, comes into play, because somehow you got to figure out a policy instrument to deal with all this. And you could come up just with a mandate for every little technology, or come up with a performance standard for every little technology, or, and which gets very complicated and very hard. So the world of policy, just to play up that theme, is somehow to take this knowledge and this data and come up with a way of managing it. And there's compromises and trade-offs and simplicities, but it comes down to what's easiest to administer. It's easier to regulate 10 oil companies than it is, 300 million people, for instance. That's why we regulate the car companies and the oil companies instead of regulating fleets or people.
But let's continue the discussion.
Okay, I knew I would get him going on this.
Great.
No, no, but no. But
Oh, you meant
it-
now? Okay,
no, I
sorry.
meant right now. Let's put aside the carbon emissions where I think LCA, the averaging over 30 or 100 years becomes even more problematic. But we're talking about health effects, right? And so anything that gets averaged over a period of time, when that just happens at a very discrete point in time, raises questions, right? That are perhaps different than what the regulatory policy is. From a health effects, it matters, right? If you disturb soil and you release pollution into the air for doing so, those effects are more acute, right? They may dissipate over time. You know better than I do the nonlinearity of those concentrations of pollutants that get introduced at a discrete period of time, right? Or from a mining or an extraction process that gets emitted at that time, right? It's using the average and assuming that that average is going to affect people over long periods of time, then having a very, very profound effect over a very short period of time is a fundamentally different effect that LCA may not give you the right information on, that you as researchers have to then go and understand how to extract and get the right data into your models.
May I jump in? So I think I'm positioned physically in the right spot between the two of them, which is very good. I guess if from my perspective, what I was suggesting is I actually think when I mentioned all of the types of modeling, every one of them is valuable. I think we're at the point of how do we bring them together in the most thoughtful way to help us in this particular community really make sense of the trade-offs. So I think LCA, fantastic for all the reasons that have been talked about. Energy system modeling, fantastic. How do we actually bring them together to really be informed about the choices that we're going to be making and decisions we're going to be suggesting and optionality we're going to be proposing? That's what I was saying.
Great. I
And
mean,
I think we'll all agree, right model for the right question,
exactly.
right?
Yep.
that's
And
great.
there's the trade, just very quickly is, there was one of the studies was done at UCLA about looking at equity, climate and pollution and, somehow coming up with a way of being able to optimize the reductions. And that's like really hard to do, but it's this challenge that you just said, okay, we bring all the models together and get more and more sophisticated, but we're a long ways away. And partly because in the real world of managing these things, and William brought up a real good point. I was thinking mostly about carbon. I often think you make good points. I was thinking about carbon, he talked about health effects, but we don't necessarily adopt rules or regulations or policies, just for one thing or just for another. Like at CARB, we were adopting these rules, like for zero emission vehicles, it's for both air pollution and climate. And so pulling it apart is in a policy world is hard to do.
I never do life cycle analysis would inspire such debate. Tim, when I come back to some of the comments you made, you mentioned the adverse federal policy climate, and I think there's mostly uncertainty right now. We'll see where it settles out. But does this mean there's an opening for like state level or municipal level? Like, what are some of the other policy levers out there while we wait for federal policies to like settle down? And I know some of them will stick and some of them will be reversed, but can you comment more about the policy landscape and what some of the opportunities are?
Yeah, there are a number of state initiatives. I'm thinking of states like New Jersey, New York, Washington State, Oregon, obviously California, that are applying as much sort of public funding as they can towards electrification, towards infrastructure build out. But some of those states were relying on things like the REVI program to get underway. They were relying on their ability to opt into regulatory mandates initiated in California that they can adopt in their states. If the collateral attack on those regulations is successful, that sort of stick on the carrot stick equation might disappear, which is problematic. But even giving due regard to these state programs, these state funding efforts, even purchase incentives, the fact remains that for some period of time, extended now by the change of administrations, the price point for, again, in the truck sector, the price point for a new BEV, the weight of the battery for a current BEV truck, the weight of the vehicle for a current BEV truck, the fact that you may need to buy 1.5 to 2 BEVs for every conventionally fueled truck. The current unavailability of infrastructure, the current assumptions that centrally housed fleets can afford to get charging infrastructure in place. They can work out the situation with the local utilities. They can get a substation if they need one. All that suggests that, to me, the timeline, the envisioned timeline is shifting beyond 2032, out closer to 2040, and suggests to me that we can't wait for that initiative to turn over the inventory. Again, we don't want to regulate, in my view, from the nose of the dog. We want to, and I don't mean anything adverse against dogs. I love dogs. We need to regulate the body of the problem. And that suggests to me an incentivized replacement program that I think if we did the right QRA would show enormous returns on the dollar, far exceeding investments in ZEVs, at least for the immediate future.
So I'm going to say, even if the policy levers do exist in other places, the uncertainty creates its own delays and other problems. Maybe one more question for you, Tim, and then we'll go to you in just a second, audience. Dan said something, we regulate the oil companies because there's fewer of them than people. It's easier. When I think of engines, there's like, what, 25,000 locomotive engines and 10 million plus heavy duty truck engines, and then 200 million plus light vehicle engine. Should we be focusing on different parts of the engine sector as well? Does it make sense for us to do more effort on locomotives instead of trucks or other things because there are just fewer of them?
I mean, were we to want to keep the ZEV programs on track as much as possible in the interim dark ages, we would identify, and some programs have identified, those applications that are most suited to ZEVs: school buses, municipal buses, last mile, medium duty delivery fleets. Think of Amazon, FedEx, UPS, perhaps garbage trucks even, along as soon as you can get the power takeoff technologies in place. Other fleets, and heretofore the regulations have been fleet kind of agnostic. They've basically said, hey, by 2035, 40% of your sales of trucks need to be ZEVs, you figure it out. I would submit that's not the best way to go because it's too disparate, not focused enough. Find the fleets, find the applications, switch your locomotives, for example. You can have a tender that's a big battery. You could do it. And as long as you're not going long haul, that should be fine. There are applications that we could get to within the next 10 years and be successful and have a cost utility that would be favorable.
That's great. And Daniel, like comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to provide a little context here. And that is, I just spent 2 weeks in China. In China, they're selling electric cars for $10,000. They're selling electric trucks for $80,000 or $90,000, a fraction of what they cost here. This is how the world is going. And maybe those vehicles won't come to the US in the near term because of tariffs, but they're going to the rest of the world.
Mhm.
And if our industry, our truck companies and our car companies stay focused just on the US market and the trade barriers that are created to protect it, it's going to become a shrinking industries. They're going to become part of on the North America island. And so it's not that I have an answer here, but boy, we should be thinking much more broadly than just, what are the cost of the trucks and the cars, electric, and what are these challenges? The rest of the world, in China, 50% of all the car sales in China are electric. 25% of all the truck sales are electric. Europe, 25% of all the sales are electric and increasing in all those markets.
That's great.
So that's a great macro picture, but we don't have subsidized industries in the United States the way we do in China. And one reason we're here is to talk about health impacts. One reason we're here is to talk about how to ameliorate health impacts as soon as possible. And one reason we're here is to talk about how to ameliorate health impacts as soon as possible in the most impacted communities. And that's what I'm talking about too.
It's great. A question up here at the front microphone.
So Chad Bailey, EPA OTAC, I worked on all the rules. They're there if you want to read them. There's actually a lot of good work that went into them. But what I wanted to ask about was, I think it was Dr. Chernikoff mentioned the word marginal, and I wanted to, that's
Marginal.
Marginal.
As opposed to average, yeah.
And if we think about that and what has been driving changes at the margin, if you think about what's happened at Home Depot to the lawn and garden segment, and a lot of it's electric now. If you look at forklifts, they're all fuel cell now. If you look at the growth in particular technologies, for motor vehicles, that was driven by essentially a large drop in essentially the cost of battery technology came down and the efficiencies went up. So it seems to me like, we didn't just sort of like say, let's make a mandate because now we can. Like it was based on, changes in prices of different technologies. And what I do know is that there's been a lot of investment and research on the part of industry, on the part of government over the last few years, and that's going to have some momentum. It's not just going to stop because now we've changed administrations. So I guess my question is, there's been a lot of incentives to invest in things because of things like the BIL and the IRA and things like that. And there have been changes that have been made and changes that are making. I guess my question is, does anybody know what that means? Does anybody know what, in the next year or two, aside from any policy changes that are going to affect things 2027 and later, what are the things that have been invested in over the last couple of years going to bear? I mean, I think we heard Pat Carr talk about, ICE engines, combustion engines, but everybody's kind of thinking in the policy space, but there's been a lot of response in the last couple of years to recent changes in the policy space. So I'm wondering if anybody's keeping track of that, and if anybody can if there's been any economists who've looked at this and even just speculate, what have industry been investing in across the board, and what does that mean for what they're going to be able to make money on in the next year of the market?
Yeah, so there's inertia in the markets, there's technology trends underway, there's technological learning. What does that mean for us in the next few years before policy changes start to make a difference? Any comments?
So I'll just talk from the medium heavy duty sector for a moment. There's been a lot of investment in battery electric trucks, joint ventures between truck manufacturers and battery manufacturers, joint ventures between electric powertrain companies and engine manufacturers, production lines converted to building ZEV trucks. All the major OEMs have ZEV trucks for sale. Some have had incentive programs with dealers, but the fact of the matter is there is no buy-side demand. And manufacturers were relying on some regulatory sticks to sort of compel the conversion of the market. If those disappear, that makes everything more problematic. And so some of those investments will not disappear, but they'll be mothballed for a little while. And some of those production lines where now manufacturers have learned how to convert them may revert. The other thing to recall, and it's significant because it's sort of a telltale, is California recently withdrew its application for federal approval of a Clean Fleets program, which was a mandate that fleet purchasers buy ZEVs. Right now we have mandates that manufacturers sell, but there was a program in California where fleets would have to buy. That regulation has been withdrawn from EPA and actually withdrawn from California's Code of Regulations. Other states might have had the opportunity to opt into those buy-side programs. That's gone. So there are near-term implications. There are near-term manufacturing impacts, and the timeline invariably has shifted out beyond 2035 targets of 100% ZEVs, 2036 targets for 100% ZEV trucks. Those timelines have to shift.
And if I could just quickly say that the numbers that I was citing to you before, in terms of at least the way we're projecting what comes in the future, it is considering, certainly on the light duty vehicle side, personal vehicle side, cost, convenience factors to the extent you could build that into any model. But obviously technology advancement, policy considerations, whether or not there's a big lever that is actually used in a region or by a country or not, those all get weaved into the model that we use. So for example, I don't know if I said this one, but our perspective is, our projection would be that by 2050, globally, you'd actually have an EV fleet of 45%. That is accounting for the, the 15 years or so to get out. So that's our perspective with all of these considerations in play. That's how we're looking at it. So we do try to factor those things in as based on the, the question that was asked.
I think you are also asking the question of how do these policy changes. I don't think there's one single answer, but I'll just tell you that the product life cycle, the product design to bring these very complex products to market are longer than the political cycles that you were referencing. So there's a big buffering effect. And sure, there's going to be some changes. Maybe some of the pressure gets taken off or the incentives change things. But you got to think of this as like a second, third order delay where over the course of decades, the trajectory is relatively going to be the same. And acute changes in 1 year or 2 or 3 years may have very muted effects 10, 15, 20 years out.
Yep.
And so again, what time frame are you thinking about when you're asking your question matters. But to Tim's point, I really want to emphasize the local matters, right? We can take these broad averages at the top, but the real effects happen, pardon the pun, where the rubber meets the road, right? They're very local effects. And so average changes in fleets matter much less than what vehicle, where is it being used, and what is the effect that vehicle has on that community or that fuel use, and whether it's a truck or a boat or a plane or a car or whatever it may be. And they're not average, right? Some communities are affected worse, right? The effect of targeting municipal buses, which very much interact with people, versus long haul trucks, which are operating on rural highways, fundamentally different effect. And it's worth saying, I think everyone here knows that, but sometimes we forget about it when we try to aggregate our analyses.
Another thing I'd say, like in the power sector, things coming online for the next 3 years were based on decision investments made in the last 2 to 7 years. And so today we're turning on a brand new solar farm and battery system in Texas from some prior, that'll happen in the next few years. So the power sector will get cleaner for a while based on prior decisions. And I don't think anyone's really advocating to build a coal plant or something. So there's some things that are baked in by market inertia and technology trends and performance. I think electric vehicles will keep coming. Autonomy will keep coming. There's a lot of things that will keep happening regardless of what the federal policy is. There might be some elements that will slow down or speed up, and I think coherent federal policy is very important. But some of the decisions that have already been decided for a while, right? Because of these long times. A question at the back microphone, please.
Arvind from PACCAR. I came here to ask a question, but I'll answer the previous question quickly and before. So from an OEM, we have invested in pretty much every technology that is that we can pivot to. Battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, different forms of IC engine. We got a pretty good pulse on what are the different low carbon fuels that fuel manufacturers might be able to provide, and how we can adapt our engines to work on various fuels. Cummins is a good example. Cummins has the fuel agnostic engine, where they try to simplify the engine, where they say, if you just the top part of the engine, which we call as the head of the engine, only that is going to change with the different fuels, and the remaining part of the engine is very common to all the fuels. So this kind of tells you that the OEMs are kind of prepared to go in different directions. But I think the problem from an OEM perspective is whenever the development is accelerated to meet a mandate, I don't think we'll be doing justice to the customers and the product that we are putting in, because now everything is accelerated and we are going after a target which is shortened beyond the normal development time that we are getting in. And these are newer technologies. These have to be tested extensively before we roll it out on the road. And it has to meet, and it's not like a light duty car where it has a couple of 100,000, not even a couple of hundred, just about 100,000 miles in life. You know, we are looking to provide vehicles that are going for 1 million miles, and that's not easy when you introduce new technology. My question, it's just a food for thought and add to the complexity of Tim's multi-billion-dollar infrastructure problem. I think in the future, since it's challenges for emerging technologies, I think the electrified transportation segment will be competing with data centers for energy consumption. And I don't think this is it's a very trivial aspect. You know, right now it might seem a non-issue, but there is a reason why major data companies are wanting to go off the grid. They want their own power supply because they can, you know, always provide that whatever the data transfer and the need for that, and which is becoming very important. And I think if the transportation has to be successful, maybe we have to think something like that, you know, go off the grid specific for transportation, which could be, you know, a much more distributed grid, possibly nuclear power plants. I think they are very small reactors are coming into place. I think the Department of Energy is also has kind of eased the processes of developing newer nuclear power plants and such. So just a food for thought, because I think we might be running into other types of health impacts when we are looking at distributed power generations and stuff.
It's a great question. And maybe I'll just pop in on this one because my research group at UT studies the grid and data centers and EV charging with great specificity for ERCOT, the Texas Grid, and others. And I would say they actually aren't quite as competitive as you might think, because the data centers tend to need medium or high voltage transformers and equipment and steady supply. And light duty vehicles, at least, can use lower voltage equipment and can be scheduled in a way that's more flexible. So they might not compete directly. They might be complementary if we manage them properly and intelligently. If we just let people charge their cars anytime they want, it will compete with data centers. But if we're more sophisticated, there might be a chance for them to be more coherent and harmonious. But I wonder, I know all of you have looked at this one point. Any other comments on that question about EVs competing with data centers or anything else?
Yeah, and I think it was a good question, good comment, potentially good idea in terms of infrastructure and time it would take to do that. To the extent that folks and you know, government, industry, et cetera, would want to do that, it would take time. So just in terms of the stuff we're talking about here, that all takes time. And I think probably you might know more, but not that it's insignificant, and obviously issues with the grid are complex, but I think today, or at least by 2030, I think it's EVs, the prediction would be what, 3% pull on the grid or something like that.
Yeah, we've seen studies looking at, you know, electrification to the extent under current and anticipated regulatory mandates. And I think the overall, when you factor in light duty and even medium heavy duty, was about 4% increase. Yeah. And there is headroom already for that. So it's not aggregate demand, but it is build out. And I would just point out or add to the equation that there's not great interoperability between a light duty charger, which can be like a home-based plug-in, versus the needs of the medium heavy duty market, which require more what we call DC fast charging at something greater than 50 kilowatts, maybe 150 kilowatts, up to, if you're talking about a public service station for long haul, that could be a megawatt. So it's different for medium heavy duty.
That's great. Question here at the front microphone.
Yeah, I'm Chris Frey at NC State. I was reflecting, trying as best I can to keep track of all the great ideas. You know, I think one of the purposes of a panel like this at an HEI conference is to help inform HEI on research needs. And I think we've heard some thoughts along those lines. And so I kind of wanted to challenge the panel to distill the research recommendations maybe a little more obviously, but I guess I have a couple of thoughts related to that. One is, for some reason, the thought of deep uncertainty came to mind. And, you know, 30 years ago, when we're talking about climate change, I think this was a big concept of deep uncertainty. How do we, from a scientific point of view, deal with deep uncertainty? And yeah, I think we have had advancement in climate science where there's a lot of uncertainty, but we know a lot more than we did, and we have much more observational data than we did. And so not that the picture is completely clear, but it's coming a little bit into focus. Here, we've been talking a lot about, I guess, policy deep uncertainty rather than technical deep uncertainty. And HEI doesn't do policy, but it does policy relevant science. So another thought that came to mind was the idea of no regrets. And I don't know, Tim, if this is a fair characterization of Veritas, but it sounds like that's a proposal that would be kind of a no regrets action, given the policy uncertainties, maybe given also the technical uncertainties, that is a way to move forward, and maybe it's scalable if things change. And then I think we heard from William about, the need for marginal and maybe localized assessment. And, I think we've heard throughout the conference the importance of place and other, ways of motivating local. And then we've heard, the opportunity for accountability studies. Maybe as we see changes in the next few years, they will create natural experiments that could be accountability studies. But anyway, I'm just kind of rambling, but I'm wondering, in a sentence, what each of you think HEI could do to promote research that would advance, maybe given the kinds of uncertainties we're facing, but the no regrets opportunities that might be in front of us.
That's great. Why don't we start with William and go towards Dan? Maybe if could you take a minute or less because we're about to wrap up, unless you want me to start with Dan, so you have more time. But
No,
okay.
I'll go.
Yeah, distill down. What are the main research opportunities or questions that should be pursued by HEI?
Right. Yeah, I think, the role, at least how I view the role of highly technical organizations like HEI is not to make the policy, it's to inform the policy, right? And uncertainty is just a factor. If you're transparent about it, right, you're providing the information that policymakers, for better or for worse, will have to make a decision based on the risks and opportunities, as long as you're transparent and reasonably accurate about that uncertainty. And I think you can explore it through a scenario based, right? You've heard a number of different things. I talked about different forms of urban design and mobility systems, what types of vehicles might be out there, how might they be used? What is the health effects from the emissions profiles that might come from those types of scenarios, or a different scenario, or, in the built infrastructure as it is now, that may be subject to more constrained changes. What are the health effects? And then you find out where those policy levers are, where are you likely to have reasonable confidence in change, and we'll see what the research says, and then policymakers will have to act accordingly. That's my but you got to cover the breadth of A leads to B, C leads to D. The people will have to make decisions under uncertainty. That's just the reality of policy.
Tim.
As I tried to describe, I think we want to do a quantitative comparative assessment of interim policies to mitigate health. So under my view, we would identify most heavily impacted communities from diesel traffic and look at those communities, and then use unit risk factors from whatever epi study you want and quantify the cost of the public health impacts, be it mortality, morbidity. There's URFs for each. And then look at the relative costs of addressing the problem, either through vehicle engine replacement programs with post-2016 vehicles, in my view, and compare that maybe to the cost and efficacy in terms of reduction of public health risk costs of other intervention strategies, whether it's introduction of ZEVs or whatever, and do that quantitative assessment, economic, air modeling, risk assessment, URFs, and come up with a grid that shows you dollar for dollar what policy is most sensible in the interim. And yes, it does get HEI a little bit more into the center of policy debate, but so what?
Gary and Dan, you get 30 seconds apiece. Yeah.
I guess from my perspective, as I was getting at, I think there's a strong focus on the sort of tank to wheels perspective. And my suggestion would be, I know we want to keep it focused on transportation, but I'm going to suggest it's more about the system. And I think it's really bringing together the right kind of models and information to get a better handle on the system. So I could leave it at that, but I have plenty more ideas if you'd like to hear them.
That's great. Dan.
I have no new additional ideas, so I will pass.
Right. So a couple of things I'll say, since I got the mic, systems design is great. That also means urban systems, like William said, maybe R&D on tires and brakes since they're a source of emissions. Ammonia was mentioned, I think, by Dan and Gary, maybe ammonia methanol for maritime shipping, maybe electrified aviation, what that means for drones and other things. New ways to pay for transport support. We argued beforehand about how to pay or collect gasoline taxes for road repair, and we're happy to take the argument out to the hall right after this. Dan, you mentioned noise pollution. Electric vehicles will reduce noise. Electric drones will increase noise. What are the trade-offs we can do with there? How do we go to marginal and local and specifically geographically resolved assessments rather than average? We don't replace average old stuff with average new stuff. We have more specific analysis. And this deep uncertainty, really great question. Rob Lempert, sort of the father of decision-making or deep uncertainty, and he and I were colleagues at RAND together for a couple of years. So I think there's room for more of that, and there aren't enough Rob Lemperts around, but we need more people who think that way. And perhaps you're one of them. We can all learn from you. So I'll stop there. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for their great comments. Really a good conversation.